My name is John Woods, Chair of the International Partnership Committee and also Chair of this International Summit, and welcome to our panel on bridging diaspora through international trade and investment. I am extremely excited about this panel. It's an issue that's very important to the diaspora, and I don't feel as if we spend enough time on it, but we will explore issues today. But before we begin, I have a few acknowledgements. First and foremost, President Hoffler, thank you for your vision and your resilience in bringing this platform together. Not only this panel, but all of the issues and topics we've been exploring beginning yesterday, continuing tomorrow. The International Partnership Committee members, Kevin Judd, Yasser Palm, and Augusta Massey, thank you for all you do behind the scenes. We cannot get this done or could not get this done without you. And also our international partners, Janice Remy, the SRC, University of the West Indies, and Colorfellow Kugler Advisory Center, World Trade Law, Geneva, Switzerland. Back to our panel. Really quickly and briefly, our discussion will be framed around three primary topics: historical barriers, opportunities in the area, and we will have a discussion and dialogue on solutions and movement and directions post-pandemic. Now, before we begin, let me introduce our panelists. And after this panel, you'll understand why I'm extremely excited. Talented individuals from Africa, the Caribbean, here in the US, and I'm just excited to have them all in one space. Congressman Plaskett, US Congresswoman, representing the US Virgin Islands, member of the Powerful Ways and Means Committee. Dr. Joy Katagakwe, Chief Strategist and Advisor, United Nations Development Program, Regional Bureau on Africa. Flory Lizer, President and CEO, Corporate Council on Africa. Efe Akula, Founder, Impact Her. Felicia Prasad, CEO, Invest Caribbean. And last but not least, my colleague here at the NBA, Simone Williams, Founder and Managing Attorney of Williams Global Law, also the Chair of the NBA's International Law Section. Welcome all. Now, before I turn the panel, or I guess the mic, over to Joy, real quick, I want to show some facts in regards to commonalities, in regards to barriers and access concerning Africa, the Caribbean region, as well as the US, the Black business community. Kyle, please, if you can insert the PowerPoint. Page 2, please, second page. So if we look at the China model in regards to the diaspora, China began its development, its ascendant to an economic power in the mid-'80s. At that point, 1983, foreign direct investment was 600 million. By the early 2000s, it was up to 40 billion. But interestingly, 70% of that investment came from the Chinese diaspora. All right, page 2, or third page, excuse me. When we look at barriers to trade, whether it be in Africa, the Caribbean region, or US Black business community, same issues, similar discussions: access to capital, capital formation, market access, small and medium-sized enterprises regarding competitiveness, diversification, and links to markets, the need for technical assistance to strengthen business development, trade, and investment support institutions. Access to technology. Also, from a governmental standpoint, bureaucracies, inefficiencies, and need for policy reform, inconducive business environments, tariffs, taxes, the need for regional and strategic integration, and just as importantly, erosion of preferences and set-asides designed to address and rectify historical discriminatory practices and barriers. All right, we can leave the PowerPoint screen. So again, our focus will not be solely on barriers. We're going to move past that and begin to have a solutions-based discussion as well. But before we do that, Joy Katagakwe, again from the United Nations Development Program, will give us an overview of the climate and trade environment throughout the African region. Please, Joy.
Thank you very much, John, first for the invitation to be part of such an important discussion today, and also for the kind introduction. My name is Joy Kategekwa. I'm from Uganda, and I'm an international trade and investment lawyer. So I've spent the last 17 years trying to strike good deals for African countries. This journey started in Geneva many years ago, where I spent a lot of time at the World Trade Organization, and then moved on to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, where I established and ran the regional office for Africa out of Ethiopia for close to 5 years, until about 1.5 years ago when I moved to New York with UNDP, where I'm doing a lot of trade and development issues, but also the broader development file across Africa and advising the Assistant Secretary General in that regard. I've been asked to talk about the barriers, the opportunities, and the solutions around that. So I'd like to make 4 sort of buckets of points. What is Africa from the trade policy perspective? We often know Africa from different sort of layers, depending on what you're talking about. What is it from a trade policy perspective? Second, what is the broad generation of barriers? Third, where are the opportunities and how does the African Continental Free Trade Area sit in that? And then finally, how do you get involved? So what is this construct called Africa from a trade policy perspective? 55 African countries, independent states, each of them a rich tapestry of endowments, of the capacity to produce for export, but a capacity that is yet to be fully yielding. Africa is home to 1.2 billion people, $3 trillion economy. The multiplicity of countries that fit into this tapestry ranges from least developed countries to middle-income countries to sort of small island development states and to the broader range of developing countries. Everything from Senegal to South Africa is in that bag. It's important to make this first point around the differentiated contexts in which African countries find themselves, because it has an impact then on how they engage in trade as a tool for development. Now, if we talk about Africa as that place that is rich and diverse, it's also the place that had, I'd say, 6 of the fastest growing economies pre-COVID. So, you know, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, you know, Senegal, all of these countries moving close towards double-digit growth. What we saw about that growth is that it was impressive, but it was not a growth that transformed into industrialization, and most importantly, it was not a job-filled growth. But it tells us something good is happening. The other important thing about Africa from a definitor perspective is the character of the continent as what I would call the leader of the 4th Industrial Revolution. And you might not believe that, because that's not the nature of the messaging we often hear about Africa. But Africa, it is in Africa that you have the first innovations around financial services to digitalize, you know, the access to financial services in such a way that when we talk about the unbanked, we're talking about a different type of story than we did before M-Pesa, that Kenyan revolution, innovation that brought multitudes of people who have a mobile phone into the capacity to transact, including for business. So that is a bit the good story. But then we also see something interesting from the trade policy perspective, which is that trade policy pre-AFCFTA has not fully been leveraged for the harnessing of all of the potential in intra-African trade. So put differently, Africa is structured around large tariff walls. It ranges from 3.1 in the SADC region to 9.3 in the Central African region to about 8.6 in the Western Africa region. It means that the trade policy of Africa, if you use tariffs as a comparator, has been structured around keeping trade out of within Africa or encouraging Africa to trade with the rest of the world. It's therefore not a surprise that the numbers tell a story that intra-African trade is only 18%, with the rest of it being with the rest of the world. The rest of the world, as I said, is a trade profile that's around low volume, low value exports. So while in intra-African trade, the Ugandans might add value to their tea or to their lint and produce clothing. The broader sort of definitor for trade with the rest of the world, with some exceptions that Floria and others have worked on like AGOA, but most of it would really be in the raw materials outside the world. And yet in intra-African trade, there where you see some of the tariff barriers reduced, you start to see some more value addition, you start to see some more diversification. In fact, when we talk about intra-African trade being 18%, when you unmask that, when you try to understand what's inside of that, as I said, you start to see value addition, you start to see diversification, you start to see trade in agro-processing, trade in manufacturers, some medical products. You also start to see that that trade has at least 20% more of a technological component. And so intra-African trade is there. It has the right trajectory from a structural economic transformation perspective, but it is so low precisely because not only are the tariffs set up to penalize intra-African trade, but more so because the services are shrouded in an environment of discriminatory regulations. So that is one part of the story in terms of trade policy. The other is that there are some efforts to encourage movement of people, not as far as we should go. Most of the regional economic communities have chapters around the right to move, to establish, to reside. But it's also true that the movement that's linked closer to trade, i.e. presence of natural persons, including for services provision, has much leaner commitments. And so there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of streamlining and creating a facilitation agenda for regulations to facilitate people to move along. Visas remain an issue there, but it's interesting because you still see some countries growing. So Rwanda, Gambia, Seychelles, these are countries that are not requiring a visa. If you're African, you can go. There are about 24 African countries that have e-visas. There's also a growing number of countries that grant visa on arrival. You would see the details in the African Development Bank's index on visas and visa mobility in that sense. So that is the trade policy picture. And in there, you would see that there's some challenges, but there are also some opportunities. Now, the opportunities are really that the African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to bring down the barriers to intra-African trade by doing two critical things. One is aiming for a 97% liberalization of tariff, 97% of tariff lines through a 13-year period, meaning that these barriers that have been making it hard for a Ugandan in East Africa to trade with Senegal in the West Coast will be reduced as we move into 0 for 0 on 97% of tariff lines. It's also moving in trade and services by identifying 5 priority sectors, which are tourism, finance, telecommunications, business services, and communications, the glue for industrialization, so to speak. This is important, but it has to be captured also with trade facilitation measures. I close on the question of how do you get involved? 3 points. One is that trade agreements always create opportunities for those that have a product to export. And so the diaspora, partners out there, how to engage on a strong capacity building agenda that strengthens the capacity, not just of knowing what the opportunities are, but of getting down to the bread and butter of what are the women, what are the young owned enterprises challenged with in developing export capacity. So a trade capacity building agenda that is tackling the question of utilization. The second point is responsible third-party relations, that as Africa has pivoted and come together into this free trade area, that there is a responsibility for the international community to support it by giving it room to work. Therefore, that the partnerships with Africa should be with the bloc as opposed to individual countries. And the final point is investment. For the Made in Africa revolution that will change this dynamic of 18%, we need the muscle from everywhere that can, and therefore an invitation to understand what the opportunities are to be a part of it. Africa has pivoted, the opportunities are there, the challenges are there too. It can be surmounted, but it takes a lot of cooperation, including from yourselves. Thank you very much.
Joy, greatly appreciated. Now, next up, we'll have a video provided by Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett on U.S.-Caribbean trade relations.
Greetings. I'm Congresswoman Stacey E. Plaskett, and I represent the Virgin Islands in the U.S. Congress. I want to thank the National Bar Association, your president, C.K. Hoffler, and the International Summit Chair, John Woods, for inviting me to address you today on the important topic of international trade and investment and how the African diaspora here and in the Caribbean region can support, be engaged, and benefit from the investment. First, it's an honor and indeed a responsibility to be the first member from a territory to serve on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee. Seats on the Ways and Means Committee are highly sought after by lawmakers because of its jurisdiction over key economic policy issues like tax, trade, and healthcare issues. I am now the voice for the Virgin Islands. Other residents of the territories, such as Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, Northern Marianas, indeed the island nations of the Caribbean Basin as well, on the prestigious House Committee on Ways and Means. The decisions made and laws written by this committee have a profound impact on the health and welfare of Virgin Islands families and families like them, marginalized communities, communities that have been tremendous potential but no strong advocates to fight to give them opportunity. I look forward to working with my fellow committee members to strengthen the retirement security system, social safety net, and critical infrastructure so many Americans rely on. The United States has long considered the Caribbean Basin a strategically important region based on its proximity and unique geographic features. It straddles the divide between North and South America and is home to important sea lanes, raw materials, trade, and investment opportunities, and historically has been a first-line defense against the encroachment of foreign powers. A broad range of U.S. interests in the region have been reflected in U.S. foreign policies, dating back from the Monroe Doctrine in the early 19th century through the Cold War era, culminating in the Caribbean Basin Initiative, CBI, in the 1980s, to the current efforts to thwart illegal drug trafficking, money laundering, and terrorist activities. In all cases, the United States has sought to foster social, economic, and political stability in the region while also maintaining an eye on its own economic, commercial, and strategic interests. In 2009, former President Bush described the region as the United States' third border and created what is known as the Caribbean Third Border Initiative, while Vice President Biden convened the Caribbean Energy Summit, recognizing the importance of energy issues in the region. Today, our interests in the region are compounded by the rapidly burgeoning influence of countries like China and Venezuela in the Caribbean. Of Commerce Census Bureau report, the Caribbean is ranked 8th of global nations in export trading with the U.S. Sustained, consistent U.S. presence and engagement with the Caribbean is of utmost importance during this time in order to preserve the vital connections our country has in the region and to prevent the proliferation of markedly different political influences and policy. CARICOM was established on July 5th, 1973, with the signing of the Treaty of Chaguaramas. It was built on the trials and errors of previous unification efforts, beginning with the ambitious West Indies Federation of 1958 to 1962, which sought political and economic unification. Despite encouragement by Great Britain, it was dissolved rapidly when Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago withdrew in favor of national self-determination. In the midst of the failure to federate, the hope, if not the necessity, of economic integration remained alive and took the new form in 1965 with the Caribbean Free Trade Association, CARIFTA. It marked the beginning of free trade area and was replaced 5 years later by the deeper commitment under CARICOM. CARICOM began as two linked concepts, the Caribbean Community and the Common Market. Although conceptually yoked, they were devised as separate legal and institutional entities that provided a needed flexibility to accommodate differing national preferences for regional integration. The Caribbean community compromises multiple functional relationships and institutions designed to integrate the region politically, economically and legally. CARICOM was not given supranational authority, however, dropping any pretense of another federalist experiment, which allowed for relative ease of ratification. This arrangement, however, did not lead to full regional integration. In the words of two CARICOM experts, CARICOM is a structure created by national governments to make national policies more effective by pursuing them within a regional framework. The CARICOM countries inherited narrow production structures from their colonial economic heritage. As captive producers and consumers for the European states, Caribbean economies were developed to complement their counterparts across the Atlantic Ocean. Let's be more blunt, to serve the needs of the European states. Created with Eurocentric investment and sustained by protected trade, plantation economies arose based largely on sugar and banana production. Minerals extraction and eventually tourism came along much later. The colonies were equally dependent on the European imports for manufactured goods and food, a relationship that endured for centuries and has carried forward into the post-independence period. As a result, the Caribbean trade regime has remained relatively undiversified, sheltered from competition, and poorly linked to domestic food and manufacturing production that could have promoted broader-based development. The United States has benefited by this, as stated previously, with the Caribbean region ranked 8th globally in export trading with the U.S. The region is completely dependent on the U.S. and to some extent Cuba to the north and Venezuela to the south as the provider of imported goods into the region. China and Taiwan are now fighting for their share of the dependency trade. The Caribbean economies, therefore, were poorly positioned to make the leap to global competition. As trade preferences eroded, the Caribbean's high production costs and tariff rates exposed its lack of competitiveness. The encroaching global economy, however, has begun to force change on CARICOM's trade and investment relationships, irrespective of the region's capacity or willingness to adapt. The most significant adjustment to the trade regime has been the declining importance of trade preferences with the EU and the United States. Unilateral preferences with the EU are being replaced by a reciprocal economic partnership agreement, while the relative benefits of unilateral trade preferences with the United States continues to erode as multilateral liberalization and U.S. reciprocal trade agreements, beginning with the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994, expand. At the same time, intra-regional CARICOM trade shows little promise for growth, and as stated above, Latin America and Asia are emerging as increasingly important trade partners in the future. The implications of these trends for CARICOM are still unfolding, but at least suggest that for many countries, particularly the smaller ones, manufacturing and agricultural exports may continue to decline relative to service trade, tourism, financial, educational. These alternatives' traditional production and trade patterns, however, are not developing fast enough to mitigate full employment, full income, and outward migration problems. Economic transition will be the greatest challenge to CSME and perhaps define its reason for being. In this context, changing economic relations with CARICOM's major partners are explored after a short review of its current trade and investment profile. CARICOM views its long-range development strategy as critical for addressing unemployment, poverty, outmigration, and other economic problems that affect political and social stability. The CSME, as a framework for deepening integration both within the region and with the world at large, sits at the center of the strategy. Intra-regional integration is incomplete, but plans call for deepening the effort, and progress has been made in achieving greater functional cooperation of the public sector. The trade and investment rules need significant tightening. New public revenue sources to replace lost tariff revenues must be identified, and there is much to be done before a grand scheme of full factor mobility and macroeconomic policy coordination can be realized. Managing the process of insertion into the global economy is the overriding task. As much as Caribbean leaders have identified the need for CARICOM to increase productivity by opening the economies to global competition, the region has hesitated to adopt fast-paced change in its trade regime. CARICOM insists on a measured, if not protracted, transition to full trade liberalization, whether addressing the Doha Round, EPA, or bilateral talks with the United States. Special and different treatment is considered necessary in all cases. The region's historically privileged trade relationship with Europe and the United States, however, has not helped CARICOM prepare for trade liberalization with the world. CARICOM's insistence on a lengthy transition to full trade liberalization could even delay policy reforms it considers central to the success of CSME. Contradictions such as these are inherent in a diverse region attempting to unify economic policies of 15 countries and may naturally resolve slowly. This prospect points to the need for decisive collective action to move ahead meaningfully with the CSME. Circumstances may already be forcing the region to act. Choices will have to be made in which a lack of decisiveness can be costly. Adjustment to the negotiated EPA with the EU will be a challenge and invite procrastination. Similarly, U.S. CARICOM trade relations must be redefined for the 21st century. There needs to be a clear action on trade policy that is comprehensive and encompassing of 21st century trade elements, not just food, commodities, and small manufacturing, but Bitcoin, financial services, knowledge-based products, along with opportunities that will allow the U.S. to compete in the region through supporting alternative green energy new trade routes. As the expiration of CBTPA preferences come upon us, reimagining a more equitable and robust relationship between the U.S. and the region should be engaged. The United States has long turned to trade policy as a foundation for supporting economic development and political stability in the region. The rationale is predicated on the belief that growth and stability breed conditions conducive for deeper cooperation in such important policy areas as countering illicit drug trafficking, immigration, and terrorist activity. Congress has had and may continue to have a deep and broad policy agenda in mind as it contemplates the next steps in formulating U.S. trade policy toward CARICOM. Finally, let me say this. I know this is about the diaspora and trade in the region and with Africa, but as an American government official, it is important that I address immediate current issues. As a first step to supporting a more robust trade agreement, the U.S. has an opportunity to examine our relationship in the Caribbean Basin through the present health crisis and continued natural disasters in the Caribbean, which create a perfect storm for nations like China to gain unfair advantage through onerous, usury agreements with desperate island nations. China has a pattern of making multi-billion-dollar loan investments to developing nations. When debt payments fall behind, China enters multi-generational lease ownership of vital strategic infrastructure in those countries. In the Caribbean, that would include ports, mineral extraction facilities, and refineries at our southern border. Unfortunately, there is a considerable and glaring lack of consistent engagement from the United States with the countries of CARICOM. Our ability and capacity to help the people and leaders of this region through the deployment of much-needed vaccines and economic and humanitarian aid is unrivaled. Our position as a world power, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, warrants a greater and much more active response to the present crisis that is happening in the Caribbean. There needs to be perspective shift from the negative posture of the previous administration to countries like the Caribbean, which are historically and demographically Afro-Caribbean. We cannot ask these nations to support us at multinational organizations and in decision-making regarding our rivals when we delay available resources during those nations' time of need. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
All right, thank you to Joy and Congressman Plaskett in regards to just giving us an overview of the climate of both the African and Caribbean region. However, I think it's just as important to hear from the boots on the ground, companies, industries, individuals actually doing work in both regions, as well as representing organizations and businesses that do work there. So we will begin the next segment of our program by hearing from our panelists who will give a brief overview, who they are, who they represent, and experience in doing business in Africa and the Caribbean. Let's begin with Flor Eliza, President and CEO, Corporate Council on Africa.
Well, thank you, John, and to the National Bar Association for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion and to join such phenomenal women who are looking at this important issue of how we can promote more trade and investment between the diaspora and the nations of Africa, as well as the Caribbean. I'm actually Panamanian born, but have focused much of my career on Africa, so I feel it in many ways. Let me just start some key points that I'd like to make, and don't want to take a lot of your time. One, trade is a critical engine for economic growth. That is true in every nation of the world. Currently, Africa has accounts for about 3% of all global trade. That if it were increased by just 1%, would be 3 times the amount of resources that go into Africa from development assistance. So trade and investment is critical for growth. And one of the reasons why Africa today only accounts for 3% of global trade is because many of the products that it trades with the rest of the world are raw commodities. They have not been processed. There's been very little value addition, which Joy spoke to earlier. And that has an impact indeed on how they are then able to take advantage of the global supply chains to create jobs in Africa and thereby grow their economies. When you look at US-Africa trade, African exports to the US, which are about 4.1 billion in 2020, though down from 8.4 billion in 2019, that because of COVID, you'll see that it's only also a small portion of the US multi-trillion-dollar economy. And so trying to work with Africans to support them being able to go up the value chain for any of the products that they are selling to the rest of the world, even their oil, they end up sending it as a raw commodity and then importing fuel. So in every sector that you can think of, the ability for countries to diversify their trade, move up the value chain by processing their products helps. I think that another point that's important is that diaspora trade and investment can be a driver, not only really to support small youth and women-owned businesses in Africa, but to support minority, diaspora, and women-owned entrepreneurs right here in the US. It is common, as we all know, for each diaspora group to basically reach back to their own countries to invest in those countries. Many times it starts in the form of remittances, which just go to families for their personal needs. I shouldn't say just, but personal needs, and to support, for example, school fees and things like that. But other diaspora have also invested in the infrastructure. They're building schools and putting in wells and things like that in their countries. And this is something that we now see is happening more with the African diaspora here in the US and from around the world. So we need more support in several ways. One, the African governments themselves need to make it clear that they welcome diaspora investment into those countries, that they welcome back their own diaspora. We've seen that in some countries, like in Ethiopia, where they've set up a special fund and facility for Ethiopian Americans who are investing, willing to invest in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian government is providing them with some of the resources to do that, and also directing them to key sectors that they'd like to see that happen in. We also need, though, from the US government side, we need to see certain policies on our end that will do two things: support minority and women-owned businesses here so that they too can get a bigger piece of the American pie, and small businesses, as you know, actually account for the majority of US exports. People think about the big guys, the multinationals, but in fact, small businesses with fewer than 50 people account for the majority of our trade with the rest of the world. And so we need to see more support in the USG for diaspora and minority-owned businesses. There are programs in the US that are in some ways supporting US-Africa trade. There's Prosper Africa. We have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, that's investing in infrastructure in Africa. The Development Finance Corporation, which used to be OPIC, and many others. And so it's really critical that we're looking at the policies as well as the negotiations, the trade negotiations that support that. And then I think that just to wrap up, this is a unique time when in the US, in the post-George Floyd era, people are looking at economic justice and racial justice here in the United States. This is an excellent time to look at how we can support economic justice here in the US by supporting small minority-owned businesses here, diaspora-owned businesses here, in connecting with small women-owned, youth-owned businesses in Africa. And so I think that, let me just end by saying I did not introduce myself. I'm Flory Lazier. I'm the president of the Corporate Council on Africa. We have, for the last 28 years, been solely focused on promoting trade and investment between the United States and Africa. Our members are multinationals as well as SMEs, and they are both US and African, and we're invested in the key growth sectors in Africa, from agriculture to energy, finance, ICT, et cetera. And so we look forward to working with the National Bar Association as you follow up from this important summit, and how we can support both the growth that's needed in Africa, but as well as the growth that we think can happen via diaspora businesses here in the US trading with their African partners. Thank you.
Flory, thank you. That was amazing. I really appreciate how you tied the interests, development, and needs of both the continent as well as the US Black business community. Very important and needed. And it's a perfect segue for F.A. Ukala, who has a very unique perspective and practice on the continent regarding uh, small and mid-sized enterprises. Effie, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me here, and thanks to the National Bar Association for the invitation. It's been an amazing opportunity, so thank you. I think that my other co-panelists have actually laid out the foundation properly for me, starting with Dr. Joy and Flory, sort of painting the picture of the landscape for trade in Africa and what the AFCTA means. My focus here is really from the small business perspective. I'm the founder of Impact Her, an impact-driven organization that has helped or supported over 20,000 African women from 52 African countries, helping them in accessing institutional capital, accessing new markets, and digitalization, because as we can see from what happened with COVID, that has become even more important. So I would start with some of the challenges that the small businesses are facing, with the hopes that these are also opportunities for both private and public sector players. And in fact, the diaspora could help mitigate. One of them is, when we talk about the AFCTA, everyone is excited about it, but the big elephant in the room is logistics. The AFCTA will not be able to tap into its full potential economically if we do not address Africa's logistics challenge. An example there is, obviously, to take a step back, the AFCTA is addressing, the tariff barriers. I think the goal is to be able to reduce tariffs by 90%. But beyond tariffs, there are also other issues that small businesses face when trying to export their goods across the border. There have been instances where those exportation of the goods actually cost more than the product itself that is being exported, which ends up being a nuisance both to the seller and also to the buyer, deterring the buyer to not participate or not order from outside the country. So we're hoping that the reduction in the tariff barriers would help with that. But beyond that, we also have the problem of the bureaucracy or governance at the borders, whereby countries also need to look into their borders and talk to their custom officers to make sure that the politics that's being played at the borders are eliminated, that the borders are not the place where these countries are exercising their political powers, so to say. And the practical example there is, there was an instance where we had a businesswoman exporting a product. It got to the border. The consumer is about to pick it up and is basically told that, premiums had to be paid on those goods because they were from the US. After a long argument, this woman showed evidence that it was in fact from another African country, but the custom officer wouldn't have it. So those are other practical issues that we have to solve from a logistics perspective. Also keeping in mind that, for example, in other countries, the last mile delivery cost is about 28%, whereas in Africa is between 35 to 55%. Here, the government could also, governments in their different countries, or even the private sector, could help solve this problem by probably, providing a better mapping of their rural areas. I remember as a kid going to rural areas with my parents, and we're trying to find a location. You get to a spot, you stop, you ask someone for the address, they'll say, by that tree, turn left. When you count 3 houses down, you find a church. Those were the directions. And in the rural areas in this day, we still have a lot of rural areas that are still like that. So if we're talking about getting goods to the end product, if we're talking about the business to consumer method, and AFCTA happen to facilitate that, we also have to think about these practical realities of logistics. Another issue that I would raise, but also present as an opportunity for the diaspora also to participate, is the financing of those businesses. To be able to really enjoy the gains that the AFCTA could potentially present to Africa, the small businesses must also have access to finance to be able to fund the scaling of their businesses. I do understand that, Afro-Exim Bank has been doing an amazing job negotiating with different players in the market to provide trade finance. But we must also be careful as we think through, what that finance looks like, to ensure that it's not, in fact, helping to widen the gender finance gap, as opposed to helping to mend it. The terms of those financing or of those facilities have to also be, have to also work for the small business owners. It also has to work for women-led businesses that may not have as much access to collateral, that may not be able to be patient enough to, get a short-term loan for at a high interest rate. So the practical part has to be looked at, or else what's going to end up happening is that with the increase in financing being pumped into the industry, those who need it the most, women-led businesses, may not be able to access it. And lastly, I see John is up. I think that entrepreneurs and also the private sector need to think about how to work collaboratively for the AFCTA to work for Africa, in the sense that we have to really think about how do we ensure that we are deliberately sensitizing the population? How do we make sure that the people that need the information are getting access to information and actually understand what it means for them, for their businesses? And then on the other hand, having the entrepreneurs also work together collaboratively, maybe forming cooperatives to be able to meet minimum other requirements that would now present themselves as these businesses begin to expand. So I would end by saying, on that note, it really takes a village. And in this case, for Africa's continuous rise and for us to really realize the gains of the AFCTA, it would really require Africa's village.
That was amazing. Thank you, Effie. And I feel bad when I have to click on because I want to hear more, but we're going to get to it. We're going to have more from all of the above. Now, Florian Effie has given us a broad-based, holistic approach or view of the continent, doing business there from a trade and investment perspective. I would like to now introduce Felicia Prasad to give us the Caribbean perspective. Felicia, how are you?
Thank you, John. A very good afternoon to everyone. A very good afternoon to all my fellow panelists, and of course, everyone joining us this afternoon. I'm truly honored that the Congresswoman actually gave that background on the Caribbean and trade there, because it's taken a whole lot of my time up, and I'm very grateful for that. But this afternoon, I want to just share with you basically the reality that we see every day at Invest Caribbean, and we have seen for the past 10 years since we launched. And the Congresswoman touched on a very important issue as she presented her presentation on trade and investment in the Caribbean. The reality is, let me just share a little bit story in terms of the genesis of how Invest Caribbean came to be. Just a month shy of 10 years, so that was about 2011. We started this more as an investment forum with the Caribbean Tourism Organization. And our goal at the time was always to push investment and the focus on investment in the Caribbean, because here we had the Caribbean Tourism Organization that came to New York every year for 1 week to present Caribbean Week in New York, but there was never an investment component of that, despite the fact that the region is predominantly and has been dependent on tourism as its main primary income earner. So we started in 2011 as an investment forum, thinking that it would be one of those easy things since there were so many businesses already doing business in the Caribbean. But was I in for a surprise? In fact, when we got started and we invited many of these major investment companies who actually are set up in the Caribbean, taking advantages of the many tax breaks there, we were told that they weren't interested because the Caribbean is just, well, not small, not big enough. It's too small. It's not caliente enough as Latin America, and the investment opportunities are not big enough on a bigger scale as they're accustomed to. And that surprise and shock led me to a realization that we needed to consistently keep the focus on investment in the Caribbean. And that is how Invest Caribbean actually became a reality. And so 10 years on, we're still fighting some of the same battles, which is the number one barrier, despite all of the trade agreements, despite all of the tax breaks that companies get to come into the Caribbean region. The number one issue that we see today and continue to see, especially in this COVID pandemic, is a lack of access to capital. Because the reality is that American banks are hardly ever lending any money to the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region is facing a de-risking crisis. Investment dollars are not flowing in. And yes, many people have to turn to China and Russia and other places in Asia for investment capital. Because if you're a small business right now in the Caribbean, looking even for US $5,000, there is no way to actually get that. The few banks that are there are not lending or taking a risk on these small enterprises with great business opportunities, with great plans to export and expand and take advantage of the trade deals, but they have no access to capital. And that is the reality, that is the problem. And post-COVID, it is going to become a bigger problem because the few lenders who were already lending there, especially on hotel financing, commercial real estate property, they're all pulling back because of the impact COVID has had on the tourism sector. So the Caribbean right now is in a dire straits, coupled with the natural disasters that we're seeing and the hurricane season that is approaching. We have to find a different way of doing business in the Caribbean. And that means that the Caribbean diaspora has to be more engaged. We are pretty much adamant when we look especially at the remittance numbers. You look at the World Bank report that came out yesterday that showed that the Caribbean nationals here in the US diaspora sent back $15 billion to the Caribbean region in the middle of a pandemic last year. And that tells us there is an opportunity there that we need to tap in. And this diaspora is what we feel is the catalyst that can push the Caribbean forward. We also feel it is the engine that can also engage our African diaspora brothers and sisters and our African American brothers and sisters to actually push this forward. And the solution we feel is to set up an African Caribbean Diaspora Fund, because we find that both the Caribbean region and Africa is facing the same problem. And so I see John has already popped up. I didn't realize it was 5 minutes already, but I engage and urge everyone who's participating today, and also especially the many esteemed African panelists who have joined this discussion, that we look at this as a bigger picture. India has done it, Israel has done it. Let us see how we can also engage and make a difference in our regions, because it is the only way. If we can take the power back, the power is in our hands, as I say, and I think that is the only way we can face the challenges and move our regions and our people forward into a next and a different trajectory. Thank you so much.
Felicia, trust me, I was tempted to stay dark. I got into your discussion, but we'll get back to it, I promise. And that was awesome. I greatly appreciate that, the perspective and actually the investment climate in the Caribbean. Simone Williams, how are you? Simone is my colleague here at the National Bar, but she's also the founder and managing attorney of Williams Global. So she has two unique perspectives. One, in regards to the climate and the interest here at the bar, National Bar Association, as well as her experience being an inbound conduit for investment, meaning from the Caribbean region, Africa, and the US. Simone.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to
Absolutely.
be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simone Williams. I am an immigration and international business attorney in Washington, D.C. I think I could kind of bring everyone together because I'm part of the Caribbean diaspora myself, being born in Jamaica and living here in the US, as well as I represent many investors from the West and East region of Africa, as well as the Caribbean. John also mentioned I am the chair of the International Lawyers section of the National Bar Association, and I'm also the chair of the International Business section of the DC Chamber of Commerce. So I have a few different perspectives. One is that I primarily represent foreign businesses, investors, and entrepreneurs interested in investing in the United States. I do work with, as I mentioned, entrepreneurs from West and East Africa, as well as the Caribbean. And the issues that are facing my clients are that they have thriving businesses in their countries, and they're looking for stable and solid investments opportunities in the United States, as well as gaining smoother access to the US to conduct their businesses, opening up satellite offices in the United States, and finding suitable trade partners. The issues that they face include local government and regulatory barriers to transfer large amounts of funds into the United States. And I think we'll discuss that a little bit later. Some of my clients, actually, they're high net worth investors, so they're seeking investment opportunities through something called the EB-5 program, which is a US investment program managed by USCIS, a US immigration agency. This program allows investors to invest funds starting at $900,000 US in investment in projects that are creating jobs in exchange for offering them US permanent residency in the United States. Now, why this is a little bit relevant to our discussion today is that some of the approved EB-5 projects are located in US territories that are considered the Caribbean, such as Puerto Rico and the Congresswoman's constituency of US Virgin Islands. This program allows investment to be transferred to much needed projects that are looking for investment capital and funding in real estate and infrastructure. So that's one opportunity, as well as I represent investors that have invested funds to gain citizenship to various Caribbean countries, including Grenada, Antigua. So those are opportunities that are for countries in the Caribbean that are actually raising capital for their countries through their own citizenship by investment programs, they're called. As the chair of the international law section of the MBA, our section and members are committed to engaging with the African diaspora on multiple levels, including but not limited to professional services, entrepreneurial opportunities, as well as academic and cultural exchanges. I'm proud to say our ILS members are seasoned and highly respected law partners, international trade practitioners, academics, and international advocates. For example, our very own Vice Chair, Barbara Simmons, served as co-chair for an international summit, which brought together the African diaspora as it prepares for ongoing efforts to involve the diaspora on multiple levels. And I see John, I'll finish up in a couple of minutes. We're also, the ILS is also currently speaking with the African Union and working on a potential MOUs on how we can work together to support and provide advice and support services on international trade and investment on the continent. Finally, as the chair of the international business section of the DC Chamber of Commerce, we actively seek opportunities to facilitate trade and investment with African and Caribbean countries through trade missions and events. Most recently, and prior to COVID, I participated in a trade mission with our DC Mayor Bowser, and the trip was a huge success and facilitated trade and investment opportunities between the US and Ethiopian businesses, and reestablished a sister city agreement between DC and Addis Ababa. So I think trade missions are an amazing opportunity for facilitating trade and investment in Africa and the Caribbean, of course. Thanks. Thank you.
Simone, thank you. Appreciate that. We have a special guest. So before we transition into our panel discussion, let me introduce President C.K. Hoffler, who wants to have a few words. And of course, we welcome that. How are you, Madam President?
I'm fine, and thank you so much for, John, for your extraordinary work in pulling this together, pulling this whole conference together with your team. It's just been a great experience. I've listened to this panel with such intensity, delight, and expectation. And why? Because in 1987, when I graduated from law school, my focus, quite frankly, was international work. I worked for a big firm in the United States who represented various foreign governments in Africa and in the Caribbean. And so my venture, if you will, into addressing some of these issues as a lawyer, as a practitioner, started in 1988. And I dare say there's some people on the panel who may not have been born quite in 1988, but that's a great thing. I'm happy that we're having these discussions. I'm happy that the National Bar Association will be able to do something concrete, take action to move ahead the agenda of enhancing business and investment in the diaspora. That's critical. That's absolutely critical. You know, I think of the days in 1988, we represented the government of Angola. This is before the US government officially recognized the government of Angola. And there were US companies that were doing business in Angola way before the US government actually recognized that government. And so when people say, well, you know, there are all these impediments, it's difficult. There are impediments, it is difficult, but we can forge through and push the envelope and that glass ceiling and make it happen, particularly if we have work that is happening between people in the diaspora. So I'm encouraged by this discussion. John, thank you for assembling this panel. I love to see all of these magnificent women, just as an aside, that are taking charge and doing such magnificent things. When I look at and listen to Simone, I think of myself in 1988, even though I'm 37. And I think of, you know, just the new generations that are going at it, doing wonderful things and making a difference. And that's what we want to do at the National Bar Association. From this summit, we want to have concrete things that we as an organization can do, because we're 66,000 lawyers strong. There's got to be something that we can do to advance our agenda of enhancing business within the diaspora, especially for lawyers of color as well. So thank you for this opportunity. Keep on keeping on. And John, I'm going to pass the baton back on to you. And thank you again and your team.
Oh, thank you. It was great to see you. All right, folks, we can not be dark anymore. Let's have our cameras on. I want to see everyone and feel your energy. And we're going to introduce two more individuals, Marin and Kasara, two students of mine at Howard Law School, who will be sharing space with the panelists, hopefully in the next year or two. They'll be assisting in the Q&A. But before I turn it over to them, let me hear your thoughts based on what we've heard so far. Anyone, any comments, thoughts? Because I know I cut some of you off in mid-sentence through my appearance in the interest of time. But I want to hear your thoughts, please.
I think one thing I'd like to just throw out there is that some of the systemic issues that were talked about by, you know, these incredible women, you know, lack of capital, lack of support from, you know, government and other entities, trade agreements that don't necessarily benefit, you know, the people that they were supposed to benefit. One of the common themes I see is that, you know, the poorest people here and then the poorest people in the Caribbean and in Africa really have a common a challenge of trying to become a part of the larger economies, whether it's the economy within your country or you're talking about you know, within this country. You know, access to capital and all these things have a major impact on the economic status of people of color here and people of color in the Caribbean and people of color, obviously, in Africa. And I just think that, you know, as we talk about ways that we can support, and Felicia was talking about that as well, you know, we should look at some of these systemic issues to see if there's a way that we can combat them in these different places that they basically manifest.
In fact, Flory, that's pretty much the genesis of this program. Whether I'm in Botswana, Brooklyn, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, what have you, if you take out the geographical reference, it's the same discussion everywhere. So I know Felicia wants to chime in because I could see her moving intently. So I want to hear from you, Felicia.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, John, I have found, especially living in the diaspora here, one of the issues that I find is that the Caribbean and African immigrants, we face pretty much the same issues like African Americans, of course. We have come into a very discriminatory situation, and we're also facing challenges that are xenophobic. And then on top of it, we're overcoming all those challenges to send money back home to help grow that other economy. And we see this, whether you're in Sub-Saharan Africa sending back 44 million every year, or you're in the Caribbean sending back 15 billion every year, the issue is the same. The other issue that we see is regardless of the economic strata of people in these regions, they have one thing in common. They're very proud people. They want a handout. They don't want a handout. We're experiencing this exactly right now in St. Vincent, where the farmers have lost everything to the volcano that has erupted there 32 times. But they're not looking for a handout, essentially. They want somebody to give them some money so they can start their farm back and build back their business. And that is the sort of scenario that I think we in the diaspora have a better way of doing it. And that is why I think we're the ones who can solve the issues here. We cannot depend on our regional governments, whether in the Caribbean or Africa. I think they don't really have the wherewithal anymore. In some places, they have exhausted their vision. And coming in from a different perspective, from a first world experience, we bring a whole lot to the table. And I think that is why, we have to engage the Black diaspora here in the US has to engage in solutions to dealing with these issues in whether it's Africa or the Caribbean.
All right, Joy.
Yes, thank you very much, John. And it's been really insightful listening to all of the perspectives here. 4 quick points. One is that I think FM made a really good point around the need to go beyond tariffs. And that is precisely what it is. The question around non-tariff barriers, the questions around regulations and discriminatory regulations, all of that is encompassed in the body of law called the African Continental Free Trade Area. When you find the annexes, they're all about trade facilitation, standards, non-tariff barriers, and so on and so forth. But I think the point is a fair one, that you can have these treaties, but how do you move them from treaty text into the space of operationalization? That's why I also liked her point, Effe's point around demanding the treatment. I like that your colleague, your client was demanding this treatment, the preferential treatment, because businesses must insist as they cross borders. We heard about this AFCFTA. What does it mean now? They must demand this treatment. The other point, I really liked your point, Efe, around the village. It takes a village. Let's understand what this village is in trade policy. This is about enabling environments. This is around trade facilitation. This is around financing. I was trying to follow how the US does this in supporting business. And they seem to have a 3-pillar approach. Identify the opportunity, get deal support, finance it. We can learn from that. And finally, Felicia, just listening to you, I started to think there's something about the colleagues that are running this implementation process in Africa. They can learn from you, because I think we need to start branding Invest AFCFTA. And, and think about your lessons from your side and think about how we can replicate them on this side, because we need to start a campaign around make in AFCFTA, make in Africa. And so learning from the diaspora and these exchanges, I think, can teach us something. Thank you.
Awesome, Effie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joy, for those points. What I wanted to add also was when we're talking about the diaspora and how the diaspora can actually play a pivotal role in financing those businesses on the continent. I think that going back here, let's talk about the US. Women fund managers do not have as much access as they should have as their male counterparts, full stop. That's the same problem in Africa as well. Women funding women, right? The fund managers. So how can the diaspora work together to be able to encourage and fuel and give women fund managers the support they need over here? Because once you allow her to get on that decision-making table, once you allow her to get on those investment committees, what she does in return is that she's looking for other female-led businesses on the continent, in the United States, everywhere, to find where are the best female-led businesses and how can I fund them? So I think that could also be an opportunity for the diaspora to plug into, to figure out, and also the Caribbean, right? To figure out how do we make sure that we're positioning women fund managers here, giving them the support they need so that we can start to benefit from that trickle-down effect.
Thank you. Now, Simone, you made a comment which I thought was very intriguing about your clients. And again, I don't want you to breach any confidence. But what's the process when someone comes to the U.S. and they want to invest in a local business? Is there an index? Is there an approach? Or is it just based on relationships?
Well, you know, everyone is, I have a very unique perspective because I am working with the African diaspora and the Caribbean diaspora for that matter, that they are investing in the US large amounts of money and also setting up and giving back to their countries in Africa or the Caribbean. So the fact that they are, sorry, John, if I'm not answering your question, because Effie just mentioned.
No,
something.
You are.
Okay.
I hear it. It's coming. You are.
But my point is, there's the barriers that they are finding is that they're not permitted to transfer large amounts of money for investment purposes in the United States. There's restrictions on that. And so there needs to be some type of government regulatory reform on a national and regional scale in which there's a mechanism in place to allow for free trade and flow of funds, because right now there isn't. And that's the barrier that we're seeing with these investors. They want to invest, but they simply can't. The government is restricting them from investing. So we have to enforce some type of anti-corruption procedures in these countries or something where there can be a free flow and investment. And that's the barrier that these investors are finding, particularly from the regions and the countries in Africa for that matter. So for us to open up these opportunities for them, there has to be reform at the end of the day. And I don't know if did that answer your question? And I think in terms of,
Yeah, it did. It did. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of them, and I literally work with investors that are investing, that have set up their businesses here, and that have acted as, they set up their business and they're now able to export back to their countries and import their goods and services into the United States. So they're effectively setting up their own trade route. And I think for us to kind of encourage that, so that they could in fact train, create their businesses and then train their employees and individuals in their countries to now send the goods and services back to the US. So have this this dual trade route, I think would be something worth considering, and something that I'm actually helping to work on in the private sector.
Awesome. Let me ask this question, and it's a piggyback to a question I asked Simone, and I guess it's for Flory and Felicia initially, and I'm sure Joy and Effie may chime in as well. When we look at raw material versus processing, if there was more of an emphasis on opportunity to process, would it be easier not to illegally, but legally circumvent some of the barrier issues in regards to investment by having multiple countries representing the diaspora to be involved in a product and an output?
Well, I would just say that trade agreements give access. So like you have the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's been an opportunity, but access alone is not sufficient. And so to your question, John, a lot of times what we see are supply side constraints where the suppliers at least on the African side, which is what I know, don't get the support that they need to be competitive in producing the products that are needed, and they don't get the support in being able to as I said earlier, add value. And so if someone only gives you a minimal amount of money for raw fruit, but doesn't invest in you if you want to set up a small facility to process the fruit into fruit juices and other things. We do see that happening in Africa, but not nearly as much as we need to. And it really does depend on getting some of those supply side constraints dealt with. It also has to do with, I can't remember who mentioned it, but you have barriers to goods moving across the continent. I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area, which will be the largest free trade area in the world, is going to make a difference in that, not only for the regional and intra-African trade, but also for Africa's trade globally, because it will allow them to be more competitive. But I do think that the idea of, if you have a particular value chain that you want to work with, so for example, if you're trying to import leather shoes and leather products from Africa, you know, what are the ways that they need to be supported in order for them to be able to provide those products? They can come into the U.S. duty-free under AGOA, but you know, how many, I've been to many factories, how many factories have the skill sets, the machinery, all that they need in order to actually be able to take the hides, turn them into international quality shoes and purses and so forth. And so even when you see products sold in the African market, you know, that are leather shoes and leather bags, it doesn't necessarily mean that those products will meet the standards for shipping to other markets. So there's just a whole range of challenges that have to be dealt with, both on the ground in Africa, and then in terms of what happens to allow those goods to come into the US and other markets, the Europeans and others, as I said, at a higher level of productivity and to support manufacturing in Africa. Africa, you know, part of what happened with COVID this past year is that, you know, everything collapsed. It was both a health crisis and an economic crisis. And if the Africans had been able to supply more of the PPE, ventilators, all of that, pharmaceuticals, you know, this could make a difference in where we see things now. The economies are just beginning to open back up, which is exactly what they need to support them. So again, it's access and opportunity, but it's also, do you have the technical skills? Do you have the technologies? Do you have the training of your staff? Do you have the capital? Do you have all of that on the other side to actually take advantage of the opportunity? And again, the same thing really stands true for those here who are looking for opportunities to do more.
Awesome. Now, Felicia, please respond as well, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kasara and Mal, please.
Well, John, I have to say, listening to Flory, I was thinking she was talking about the Caribbean as well, because it's the same situation that we have there. I mean, look, Guyana, which is now has all of this oil that will be coming out of there, they do not have a refinery. So the wealth is going to be sucked out again, and the people are going to be left in the trenches. And that's just the reality. You know, the infrastructure is not there. The finance to finance the infrastructure is not there. Now our roads and our ports are owned by China. We're in debt up to our necks. And that's just the reality. And we have to find a way to change this trajectory post-COVID.
Wow. Kasara, Marin, you're up. Please, fire away.
Great. Thank you everyone for being here. This was a really great discussion. I'll go ahead and ask the first question. So the first question was directed at Ms. Simone. And the question is, how do you see the advent of cryptocurrency changing and enhancing investment opportunities for your clients?
Ooh, that's a good, interesting question, because wow. Well, the truth is the government and a lot of my clients are investing in the United States. They're coming from, lots of them are coming from the the continent and some the Caribbean. So they're investing in the United States. So we're looking at the US government accepting cryptocurrency, which I know that they're not. So unfortunately, you know, in terms of showing a critical component of investing in the US is showing where the money comes from. We always have to show where the money is from, the flow of funds. And so the source of that the funding has to be real, has to be coming from somewhere. And unfortunately, I don't think cryptocurrency would count as money that they're going to accept as at least based on my experience and actually working with an individual in that space. Yeah, I think at this point anyways, maybe Elon Musk will make any other Twitter remarks, but and that might change, but for now it's not going to work in the US at least. And I work with a lot of foreign investors investing in the United States.
Thank you so much, Simone. The next question we have from the Q&A panel, unless anyone else wanted to address what Ms. Simone had just answered. At the Obama US-Africa Summit, the Brookings Institution panel, Strive Masiwa said that there was enough capital in Africa to fund African businesses. Has anyone followed up on this in terms of assessing these sources and supplying money to these businesses?
Well, I was fortunate to attend that first US-Africa Leaders Summit. You couldn't attend everything. There was so much going on. But, you know, on the issue of the capital, we actually do hear two things that are actually in opposition to each other. One is that there isn't sufficient capital and finance for people to move forward with trade and commercial transactions, right? And businesses are desperate for capital. But then we also hear from folks that there is a lot of capital out there, but they can't find bankable projects. And I have always found those two things just like mind-boggling. How can both of those be true? But I actually do think both of those are true. I think that there are investors who, if they had projects that had been vetted, which were, you know, where they could share the risk with, you know, institutions, whether it's, you know, the Development Finance Corporation or the African Development Bank, they would then go in with those resources. But because they don't have anyone that they believe they can work with to package it up right for them, then the capital does not move. On the other hand, I think, you know, I've met far too many small business people in Africa and many here as well, who simply cannot get loans from banks. They do not have, people have put up their homes and, you know, to tap equity, which, by the way, is one of the main ways that small businesses actually get capital to support their enterprises. But if you don't have a home and you don't have equity in your home, then what do you do, right? So I think that this has to be approached from both sides. We have to help the people who say they have the capital, like Strive. You know, we know that there are, you know, millionaires, billionaires on the continent. We know that there are, you know, huge opportunities in terms of financing they have. But how is it tapped? I think that's a critical issue. And then I think we have to focus on SMEs and how we can support them in getting a little piece of that capital that's out there. You know, especially for folks who say, well, I'm only going to invest, you know, $500,000. There are a lot of small businesses, they can't really absorb $500,000. They're looking for $50,000 or $100,000. And so you get people who say, no, I'm not dealing with that. So I think small business has its own special financing needs, which I don't know if Strive was really addressing that. He could be talking about the people who are at sort of another level of doing business in Africa.
And if I may add to that, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, but if I may add to that, because this is something that we work with our women almost on a daily basis that impact her. what we've been trying to do was to encourage investors to, take off the lens you have and put on a different lens, and let's, look at these businesses from a fresh perspective. I was speaking to someone about 2 years ago or so, and she said to me, look, we have the capital, we want to invest in African businesses, but can you give me a list of, women-led businesses that are making over $1 million a year in Africa? And I paused and I asked her the question, do you really want to invest and make a difference? Or are you just finding a place to throw the money to, right? Because if you really want to create a kind of change that we're talking about that Africa needs to grow, you have to be looking at those smaller, you have to look at the smaller ticket sizes. You have to be looking at the smaller businesses. Why? Because they're the ones that employ about 77% or so of Africa's population. So I think that, this is a conversation that we have to continue to have with investors to say, put on a different lens. Let's really look at those businesses and their potentials. This is not Silicon Valley, right? If we want to go to Silicon Valley, we know where it is, but this is not it. Let's look at promising small businesses that have the potential to grow, to scale, and make impact in their communities.
Thank you all. Unless someone else has additional thoughts, I'll go on with the next question. Okay, perfect. The next question is, what steps need to be taken to establish the investment fund that Ms. Persaud had suggested earlier? In addition to that, is there, as far as like what we're talking about right now with the investment protocol that's supposed to be coming up the next few years, will that impact small business investment or anything in the small scale?
No, should I just take that? Okay. Well, pretty much what has to happen is you have to work with either a bank or a foundation, maybe the IDB or Calvert Foundation, for instance, in Washington, which has been doing a lot of these diaspora bonds and funds, and have that set up and structured so that then you market that so people within the diaspora can then buy those bonds, and that becomes an income earner for them. Obviously, they're earning money. Now that bond is obviously traded, and that earns money that is then used to invest in these infrastructures or in businesses that are back in these regions. And so that's basically how a bond works, or a fund, in this instance, a diaspora fund. I know there are several countries that have done them individually. India has done it successfully. Israel has done it successfully. Nigeria has actually done it. And Ethiopia has also set up a diaspora bond. But if we can do it on a bigger scale, on a bigger regional scale, I think that is really going to make much more of an impact in both regions, since we both have the same problems, obviously.
Oh, wow, that was amazing. I think we have time for one more question. And Felicia, while you're up, quick question. One of the guests, I guess the Congresswoman made reference to Jamaica and Trinidad not being, or at least at one point, not being part of CARICOM. Is that still the case?
No, it's not. I mean, Jamaica and Trinidad are very much a part of CARICOM.
I knew the answer, but I wanted to make sure. All right, good deal. One more question for the panel.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So a question we have is, have U.S. professional athletes and entertainers been approached to develop capital to invest in African Caribbean trade? And this also aligns with additional question we have is, how can ties be strengthened and partnerships formed concerning the African Caribbean and U.S. Black-owned communities regarding trade and investment?
Sorry, can you repeat the first question again?
No problem. To make it easier, I'll include both in the chat. But to repeat, the first question is about U.S. professional athletes and entertainers and whether they have been approached to develop capital to invest in African Caribbean trade, which leads to the larger question we have is, how can ties be strengthened and partnerships formed concerning the African Caribbean and U.S. Black-owned business communities regarding trade and investment? And I'll put both in the chat at this moment.
I think for the second part of the question, I'd be happy to answer. In terms of what I've been seeing, participating on these trade missions and with organizations that are bringing businesses, bringing attorneys, the National Bar Association is very good. There, we've had, I also participated in the mission to Senegal and Ghana, and bringing business owners and attorneys, bring them in the country, letting them meet the business owners, and facilitating trade and investment discussions, and looking at the opportunities in the country, and having those types of trips have been, I think, very useful in helping to increase the visibility of these businesses and increase investment and trade opportunities.
And I'll piggyback off that. I've coordinated several trade missions, and to Simone's point, investors have to see and touch. That's why real estate is always so popular, something you can actually touch. So it's important that whether it's athletes, entertainers, et cetera, that they actually on the ground get a feel as to what's going on before they're willing to actually make an investment, unless they have relationships on the ground that they'll invest through. And in regards to actors and entertainers and athletes, what's interesting, I've noticed a lot of African-American actors, they're making investment in Nigeria's cinema. Very interesting. And I'm wondering if that's something that will take off eventually. Everyone that I thought pretty much died on screen here, I've seen them on screen in Nigeria. So that's a pretty interesting phenomenon.
And I could piggyback on that I've worked with some African-American actors that are trying to invest in Nollywood. So yes, that's definitely true.
Yeah, and to add to that in regards to trade, so what we've done at Impact Her has been when we've had like trade shows here, or when organizations have trade shows here, we've able to facilitate, to bring the women here, to make the vendors. We do this for a week. They go back with a handful of other minority business owners, contact information that they can start sort of engaging in trade with once they get back to the continent. But with regards to celebrities, I would also highlight Akon's work in Africa. I think particularly Senegal. I believe it's a light project or so. So I think we've found a few of them that go back voluntarily to figure out how to invest in their continent, or some sort of exchange trade program.
Yeah, he has energy program in Senegal. Please, Laura.
I was just going to add that, Corporate Council on Africa, we've led many trade missions across the continent. One of the last ones we did was to Sudan after the economic sanctions had been lifted. And in our group, there were probably 3 Sudanese Americans who were going back to Sudan after many years, not just to visit family, but specifically to meet with the business leaders and the government leaders, where we had set up meetings for these partnerships to evolve. And so I think it's important, John and FA and others, to actually make it possible for these trade missions to happen, and for people to meet, from the different regions. On the actors and people of high net worth here in the U.S., we've also seen that they've gone back. The former owner of BET, Bob Johnson, I went to a fabulous hotel that he financed and built in Monrovia, Liberia. I've seen investments from African Americans. Some of them are well known, and maybe some others not so much. But I think that there are actors, athletes, especially like in the NBA. There's NBA Africa now, and a number of them are also pushing for investments into African countries, and to being owners, and not just the players. Hello.
John, if I may throw in just a few words, I think we are in the best position we've been in terms of African trade policy and Africa as a value proposition with the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'd really encourage the diaspora to dig deep and understand what is in these goods offers, what is in the new tariff book, what is zero rated for duty-free treatment on the continent, what is in these services, the 5 sectors I spoke about earlier: finance, tourism, communication, business services, and I think communication, did I say that? I said them earlier. Dig deep and find out what is in this market, because then you link investment decisions to that. So there is a market. It's defined. It has committed to giving preferential access. You just have to establish on the continent. So again, that marriage between trade and investment is critical. Thanks.
I am sad we have to end, but it's actually the beginning, because I'll echo the words and sentiments of President Hoffler. The NBA, I have a strong feeling that we're going to become a conduit to not only continue this dialogue, but to initiate action. So Felicia, Flory, F.A., Joy, and Simone, you and I run together. We'll be in touch, and we'll continue the dialogue as we move to action. And if you want lawyers, stars, Sarah and Moran, they're coming. So you better get them on the cheap now. Thank you, folks. We appreciate you all for tuning in. This summit has been amazing. This panel was wonderful, and I thank you all. Take care.
Yeah.